guys, how are you doing today? So we are going to talk about lesson 7.2, solving two-step equations in the form of P parentheses X plus Q equals R. So the learning target for today is I can write two-step equations in that form and use inverse operations so that I can solve equations. So in my opinion, personally, the book calls it a two-step equation. In my opinion, I call it a multi-step equation, but tomato, tomato. What we're going to need to do. Before you do anything, whether you call this a two-step equation or a multi-step equation, before you do anything, you must do the distributive property. Distributive property. So you got to do that first. After you do that, then you follow the normal steps. Add or subtract depending on what's going on, and then you multiply or divide, of course, depending on what's going on. All right, so now that we've got that established, let's go ahead and get going with this. All right, it says to use the properties of equality. That means whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. And I need to use inverse operations. Well, yeah, inverse operations to get my variable all by itself. So looking at this, number one, I see that I'm going to have to do the distributive property. How do I know that? Well, you know what? I see I have a constant multiplied to an expression inside of parentheses. So that right there that I highlighted, that tells me that I'm going to have to do the distributive property. What I mean by that is I'm going to distribute the 3 to, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do it in that. I need to distribute the 3 to both terms inside of the parentheses. And when I say distribute, I mean multiply. So when I multiply 3 times x, that's going to give me 3x. When I multiply 3 times 5, that gives me 15. Add it inside the parentheses, going to add it outside the parentheses. So I'm going to put a plus here. Now, I'm going to just rewrite everything else. So put the equals 45. And now looking at my strategy with my add, subtract, multiply, divide, my strategy is going to be to subtract 15 from both sides because I'm adding 15. And then the 3 and the x, I see that x is being multiplied by 3. So the inverse of multiplying by 3 is dividing by 3. So that's my strategy. I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides, and then I'm going to divide by 3. So subtract 15. Remember, you need to show it that you're doing whatever you're doing to one side, you have to do to the other side. So you have to show that. That communicates that understanding to the person that's reading your equation. So 3x, or reading your solution, that is. 45 minus 15 gives me 30. All right, subtracted. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 3. And that gives me x is equal to 10. Of course, we could go back and check. Put in 10 in for x. 10 plus 5 gives me 15. 15 times 3 gives me, you know what? 45. So we're good. We're good. All right, looking at number 2. Number 2, again, I need to do the distributive property. I know that because of this right here. So that means I am going to distribute the 2 to the x and the 2 to the 4. 2 times x gives me 2x. 2 times 4 gives me 8. Add it inside the parentheses, add it outside the parentheses. Didn't do anything with the equals -20, so I'm just going to bring it straight on down. Now I'm going to talk strategy. I see that I'm adding 8 to the variable, so that means I need to do the opposite. So I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. Then I see that 2 is being multiplied to x, so I got to do the inverse, which is divide by 2. That's my strategy. Subtract 8. Subtract 8. Okay. Gives me 2x is equal to negative 28. I know that's negative 28. Two negatives. That means I'm adding the two numbers. Divide both sides by 2. And that gives me x is equal to negative 14. Negative divided by a positive means my answer is going to be negative. If I plug that in, take negative 14 plus positive 4, that gives me negative 10. Negative 10 times positive 2, that gives me negative 20. Ooh, we got it. All right, let's move on down to number 3. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is I would like for you to pause the video, go ahead and do this one, and then come back and let's check your answers. All right, I got n is equal to negative 4. And you know what? I already did the check, but I'm going to double check. So negative 4 minus 2, that gives me negative 6. And 5 times negative 6 gives me negative 30. So my strategy was I did the distributive property, which gave me 5n minus 10 is equal to negative 30. Add 10 to both sides, gave me 5n is equal to negative 20. Divide both sides by 5, and that gave me n is equal to negative 4. All right, you know what? Let's go ahead and pause the video and have you guys do number 4. All right, guys, I got x is equal to 2. So that means if I put 2 in for x, 2 minus 6 gives me negative 4. And negative 4 times 3 gives me negative 12. Yay! All right, now this one's going to be a little bit more tricky because you'll notice that we're multiplying the expression inside of the parentheses by a fraction. But you guys got this. You can handle this. Just use what you know about fractions. So we're going to do our distributive property. So that hasn't changed. I'm going to multiply 2/3 times n. Well, that's easy. That gives me 2/3 n. And then I'm going to multiply 2/3 times 6. Well, I'm not 100% sure about that. So I'm going to do a side problem here. So that means I'm going to take 2/3 and multiply it by 6. Now keep in mind, every whole number, it can be written as a fraction, an improper fraction, with 1 as the denominator. So I'm going to multiply 6 times 2, which gives me 12. And 3 times 1 gives me 3. And as we all know, fractions in algebra represent division. So 12 divided by 3 gives me 4. Add it inside the parentheses, add it outside the parentheses, equals 10. So now I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. That gives me 2/3 n is equal to 6. Now I actually have a choice here because technically speaking, I've got 2/3 multiplied to n. So the one strategy is I could divide both sides by 2/3, which is great. But as we know, when we are dividing by a fraction, keep, change, flip. So then in the end, what you're doing is multiplying by the reciprocal. Well, we can use that strategy on this as well. So instead of dividing by 2/3, we can multiply both sides by the reciprocal. And remember, the reciprocal is just the fraction flipped. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 3/2. I'm going to go ahead and put a 1 underneath my 6. And then 6 times 3 gives me 18. 1 times 2 gives me 2. And 18 divided by 2 is n is equal to 9. Okay, so if I go plug that in, 9 plus 6 is 15. 15 times 2 is 30. 30 divided by 3 gives me 10. Yep, there we go. We're good. All right, pause the video. I want you guys to do this one. I know you guys can do it. Okay? Do the best you can. We'll come back for the answer. Okay, this one had the potential of getting pretty sticky. But in the end, it actually worked out pretty nicely. So, I did the distributed property. So negative 1/4 times D gives me 1/4 D, and negative 1/4 times 3 gives me negative 3/4 is equal to negative 15. Add 3/4 to both sides. That gave me 1/4 D is equal to negative 14 and 1/4. I changed it to an improper fraction because I don't know. I just prefer to deal with them as improper fractions. And so then I also multiplied by the reciprocal. So when I took negative 5/4 and multiplied it by 4 over 1, my fours cancel out because of we can cross simplify, which in the end just leaves me with just negative 57. It seemed a lot more crazy than what we thought it was going to be. All right, the next ones are word problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a next video for part 2, and we'll discuss the word problem.